The efforts of a Muslim in approaching the absolute reality do not fully rely on rational faculty. That is the most definitive aspect of Sufi practice in the history of Sufism. Sufi practitioners and scholars in this discipline find it difficult to define what Sufism is. What stands out about Sufism is that it does represent the spiritual aspects of Islam. Initially, Sufism emerged from spiritual practices in applying Islamic teachings. Then, it evolved into a corpus that explains various aspects of life, primarily the reality. Thus, Sufism became a practical canon and a spiritual vision canopy that enables one to see life more clearly, purely, and brightly. The encounter of a believer with the absolute reality can be described using the phrase mysterium tremendum et fascinans, borrowed from Rudolf Otto. On one hand, an individual's encounter with God is a moment of awe-inspiring mystery, but on the other hand, it is also a moment of captivating mystery. In the specific terminology of Sufism, this represents the two names of al-Haq, namely al-Jalal, the most majestic, and al-Jamal, the most beautiful. Al-Jalal is often understood as the manifestation of God on the exoteric side, while al-Jamal on the esoteric side. Anchored in Islamic doctrine, both the exoteric and esoteric aspects, Sufis stand at the forefront practicing and explaining these doctrines. The exoteric aspect, which is the outward aspect, and the esoteric aspect, which is the inward aspect, complement each other, and both are referred to as Sharia. However, unfortunately, later the term Sharia was narrowly interpreted, referring only to the legal formal aspect. The term Sharia actually encompasses the aspect of transmittable knowledge, ilmu riwaya, and expertise knowledge, ilmu diraya, which form the basis of religious knowledge in both the outward and inward aspects. The terms al-Jalal and al-Jamal, when drawn into scholarly discourse in Islam, also represent exoteric and esoteric discourses. The former represents knowledge preserved in the discourse of jurisprudence, theology, and philosophy, while the latter thrives within the Sufi tradition. Each discipline interprets theological issues differently, especially concerning wujud, and these differences indicate their different epistemological anchors. Both theological and philosophical discourses, let alone jurisprudence, actually anchor themselves in the exploration of the exoteric, while Sufism is the only discipline that anchors itself in the exploration of the esoteric. Ibn Arabi, dubbed Sheikh al-Akbar, was actually one who has explored the realm of the esoteric, not the exoteric like the discipline of philosophy. Ibn Arabi's profound elaboration on the issue of wujud often makes him categorized as a thinker engaged in philosophical exploration.
Therefore, in this episode, it is important to establish that the aspects of esotericism, especially in Ibn Arabi's discourse, are not solely based on pure philosophical reflection.
The issue of wujud elaborated in Sufism should be understood as the existential experience of an individual in grasping reality, not merely an effort undertaken through discursive elaboration. As the deepest existential experience within the innermost being of a Sufi, it certainly implies a personal and emotional situation, rather than a conceptual and intellectual one. Undeniably, Sufi practice does not rely on reason and demonstrative logic, but entirely involves inner states, personal experience, and immediate tasting of reality. Perceiving reality through such mystical intuition is then either initially based on or later connected to the sources of Islamic teachings themselves. And of course, because this experience is personal, each Sufi may have different experiences, making it quite challenging to provide a descriptive portrayal deemed adequate to capture the entire phenomenon of Sufism.
Initially, indeed, Sufism was not known as a doctrine during the time of the Prophet. Hence, some argue that Sufism lacks doctrinal foundations in Islam. However, to be fair, we should examine the overall portrait of Sufism and its fundamental essence.
The emergence of Islamic spiritual fervor, later termed Sufism, is closely related to the attitudes of Muslims in their early days. In the period after the Prophet and his companions, many Muslims were engulfed in political activities and worldly deceptions. In the midst of such circumstances, some Muslims felt the need to reintroduce the spirit of piety and asceticism by avoiding the worldly hustle and bustle through intensive worship practices. Historically, such practices were not new, but rather normative piety that existed since the time of the Prophet, and it was even taught by the Prophet himself. It is true that more than a century later, the term Sufism emerged, but it is important to note that this term never represented more than a signifier of the resurgence of Islamic religious practices that were threatened to be lost due to the prevalence of political activities and worldly deceptions during that time. And precisely because of this signifier, we must acknowledge the fact that Sufism is actually more of an endeavor of piety than an endeavor of conceptualization and theorization like other disciplines such as jurisprudence, theology, and philosophy. Etymologically, the term Tasawuf, which closely means wool cloth in the context of its emergence, is actually more strategic than substantive. Therefore, the use of woolen clothing at that time served as a symbolic marker to express asceticism amidst the hedonism of power and worldly worship conducted by the Muslim community. Of course, such normativity lies in the context of its time, which means that Sufi practices in modern times do not necessarily have to be marked by the use of coarse woolen clothing as in the past. Then, in its development, it is undeniable that Sufism influenced the spirituality of Muslim society in Islamic civilization. Its influence permeated every aspect, ranging from social aspects, architecture, ethics, and even philosophical discourse. And later, Sufism itself was presented as a form of discursive knowledge, thus becoming theoretical knowledge.
The issue is how personal practices involving existential experiences can then become theoretical and even philosophical discourses to understand the esoteric aspects of Islamic teachings.
It seems fitting what Saint Anselm of Canterbury said, that faith seeks understanding, not the other way around, and this is what occurs in the practice of Sufis. In the process, personal practice and existential experiences that later became philosophical discourses, especially regarding wujud as propounded by Ibn Arabi, require significant involvement of language, and in this regard, language itself must be understood as an existential mode. With language as an existential mode itself, the inner experiences and immediate tasting of Sufis, which are internally stored, can then be extracted into something external. The experience of spiritual unveiling is juxtaposed with linguistic references in order to articulate such intimate personal moments. It is indeed true that the experience of Sufism, or mystical experience in general, often transcends any linguistic framework, as Sufi experience is a veiled phenomenon that is difficult to express clearly and straightforwardly. Moreover, Sufism itself relies more on intuitive approaches than on rational and intellectual approaches. However, the impossibility of articulating clearly what the Sufi experiences feel like does not mean that Sufism and Sufi experiences cannot be discussed. As long as Sufi experiences have been expressed through linguistic symbols artistic expressions, or interpretive structures of language, then discussions about them are possible. However, the descriptive limitations of language also hinder someone from delving deeper into understanding Sufi experiences comprehensively and completely.
Recognizing the problem of language and the problematic nature of language itself, we must discuss Sufism and Sufi experiences as far as they are interpreted as moments of theophanic unveiling in the Sufi self after they are willing and able to articulate them. In other words, the experience is always limited to how it is articulated or to the boundaries of its own language. One of the scholars of Sufism, al-Wafa al-Taftazani, defines Sufism as,
quote, philosophy or wisdom of life aimed at improving the moral quality of human beings through the practice of self-refinement. This leads to the self-annihilation into the absolute reality, which is usually only experienced personally and through immediate tasting, not cognitive faculty. Its benefit is spiritual tranquility or happiness. Its state is difficult to express in everyday language due to language issues and its highly subjective nature. So, succinctly, there are 5 main characteristics of Sufism: improvement of moral quality, self-annihilation in God, knowledge through immediate tasting, tranquility or happiness, and expression through symbolic language. Some consider Sufism to operate solely on the practical ethical level, while others view Sufism as a canon of esoteric knowledge. In the latter case, Sufism becomes the starting point for esoteric discourse characterized by discursiveness and rational appearance. Consequently, topics that have emerged around the discourse of Sufism include metaphysics, the relationship between al-Haq and the cosmos, the relationship between al-Haq and human being, the soul, and so on. Hence, technical terms such as al-Ittihad, al-Hulul, and Wadat al-Wujud arise as philosophical discussions.
the internal dynamic of Sufism led al-Taftazani, a scholar in the field of Sufism, to divide it into 2: at-Tasawuf al-Akhlaqi al-Amali, practical Sufism, and at-Tasawuf al-Falsafi, philosophical Sufism. Historically, practical Sufism emerged in the first centuries of Islam, while philosophical Sufism in subsequent centuries. There is another scholar who divides Sufism into 3 categories: at-Tasawuf as-Sunni, Sunni Sufism, at-Tasawuf al-Falsafi, philosophical Sufism, and at-Tasawuf as-Salafi, Salafi Sufism.
Sunni Sufism is considered a form of Sufism grounded in the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, which are also directly reflected in the practices of piety of the Prophet and his companions. Sunni Sufism is arguably led by figures such as Al-Ghazali. As for philosophical Sufism, it also originates from practices of piety and asceticism, but it is articulated with philosophical language or terms that explain many things, including God, the cosmos, and human being. It is said that philosophical Sufism often absorbs gnosis knowledge from Greek sources, Neoplatonic metaphysics, and even teachings from the Vedas and Buddhism. Such interpretive models are often considered by more conservative and literalist scholars to be in conflict with the exoteric teachings of Islam. As for Salafi Sufism, it traces back to a Sufi named al-Harawi al-Ansari in the 11th century, and later developed through figures like Ibn Taymiyyah and his disciple Ibn Qayyim. In this categorization of Sufism, Ibn Arabi is always included in the category of philosophical Sufism. This categorization is based on Ibn Arabi's teachings, particularly his concept known terminologically as Wahdat al-Wujud, a term that has always been controversial throughout the history of Sufism. Additionally, this categorization often leads to misunderstandings about Ibn Arabi himself. His Sufi character appears to be purely a result of philosophical reflection, which of course disconnects him from the original character of Sufism as a whole. In this regard, Ibn Arabi actually reaffirms his position as follows, quote, "If you ask what is meant by Sufism, we answer, Sufism is the refinement of oneself with praiseworthy manners according to the Sharia, both outwardly and inwardly. This is called noble character. Sufism is morality. Whoever improves their moral quality, their Sufi quality also improves." Based on Ibn Arabi's own explanation, we must conclude that Sufism, first and foremost, is the process of realizing noble moral values, especially divine morals, at takhaluk bi akhlaqillah. Therefore, Ibn Arabi's main basis for Sufism is undoubtedly the practice of piety and religiosity based on authoritative Islamic sources, namely the Quran and Hadith, rather than the tradition of philosophy and pure philosophical reflection. Thus, all philosophical discourses presented by Ibn Arabi must be understood as a result of piety practices rooted in faith and Islamic teachings. Furthermore, although Ibn Arabi uses philosophical terms to elucidate the nature of wujud, it is important to note that the basis of his teachings is the improvement of moral quality, not philosophical contemplation.
Therefore, referring to Ibn Arabi as a philosopher is a reductionist attempt in understanding his figure. The use of philosophical terms in Ibn Arabi's exposition is nothing more than mere borrowing in his attempt to explain his Sufi experiences, which are actually based on existential experiences and immediate tasting of reality.
In other words, the philosophical discourse presented by Ibn Arabi is merely our surface-level comprehension to enable his experiences to be described and understood by others using the language of philosophical knowledge in his time. Therefore, it is important to note that metaphysics does indeed develop within the discipline of Sufism, but unlike philosophy, which anchors itself on logical premises and demonstrative justifications, Sufism bases its discourse on divine unveiling, kashf, and intuitive faculty, dauk, that transcend linguistic constructions. It is true that interpretations of Sufi experiences that become discourses in conceptual or theoretical level are historical in nature, but the sources and moments of those Sufi experiences are timeless or ahistorical. As a consequence, we should understand that the philosophical aspects of Sufism only occur at the level of interpretation, that is, the moment of articulation of existential experiences using language as a mode of being. Something that arises from language is nothing more than an expression, symbolization, or externalization of the hidden existential experiences within a Sufi's soul. When personal experience is externalized, the operation of discursive reasoning then works by packaging language as its expressive tool. At this point, Sufism can no longer be understood solely as an effort to enhance personal piety and morality, but it has also become a discourse and therefore interacts with other disciplines.
Accordingly, Sufism is then understood as an interpretative canon of esoteric Islamic teachings that seeks to articulately explain how humans understand phenomena from the experience of faith and encounter with the absolute reality on a personally intimate level. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.